bang, very close, and suddenly it's a bang. It's not this rumble, this distant thump.
People are sort of having this emotional breakdown around you, and it's moments like that when you realise, that it's really happening.
I've just never felt that amount of sadness for someone before. It was like ached.
I was woken up at 4 a.m. by a telephone call from London asking me for a comment on what I thought about recent events. I said, what recent events? I said, well, Vladimir Putin's just gone on TV and the war has just started.
I remember being in my hotel room and watching the speech that Vladimir Putin gave, where he talked about the denazification and the takeover of what he described as the Kyiv regime.
Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
And I remember thinking, possibly for the first time, that this was not an invasion that was possibly or probably going to happen, but it is something that will happen to all the people in this city in a matter of hours.
Мы готовы к любому развитию событий.
And in fact, it started as soon as the speech had ended. It actually felt quite apocalyptic when I was there. There was a real concern that this might actually be a 72-hour operation, that Putin would come in and capture Kyiv in 72 hours.
There are a lot of people on the roads. There was immediately a huge kind of refugee issue. So we got to Dnipro and there was a huge tailback of cars at checkpoints.
People were fleeing cities. There was a huge sense of panic.
Because the other thing that happened was this sudden panic about Russian saboteurs, commando teams, paratroopers, people in plain clothes doing stuff. So checkpoints appeared all over the roads.
It started to sink in for people just how dangerous the situation was. We were speaking to people who were queuing up to get onto a bus that I think was going to Odessa. And we were just doing a sort of standard interview with this nice couple. Suddenly this air raid siren started going off. And then I looked down at my notepad to write down something that this couple had written. And then I looked back up again and they'd just gone. And then I started to see more people running. And then suddenly there was this huge stampede of people running out of the bus station. And I sort of somewhat belatedly thought, okay, everyone's running away from the bus station. I guess I better get away from the bus station too.
The next day we went up to Kharkiv, and kind of to our own surprise, we managed to get in. The road was still open. There were Ukrainian soldiers around. So we did what you do, tried to strike up a conversation. Then one of the squaddies wanted to tell me something. He's kind of like caught my eye, this young private. And he knew that, there were people there who don't talk to journalists. And it's like, listen, there's a Russian over there. Just go over there. Don't. So I walked over in there, and sure enough, there was this dead body. The guy I think he'd bled out, and there was a civilian woman lying next to him. It was very cold, so they didn't smell very much. And there was no other explanation of what happened, because that unit had taken over the position after the fight. And then suddenly, there's that bang, very close, and suddenly it's a bang. It's not this rumble, this distant thump. That we sometimes use to describe it. A bang, close. Everybody hits the deck, and then you run.
I remember going to this cafe in Lviv. I think Tanya and I we'd been working on something, I can't remember what it was, and we'd gone to kind of collect our thoughts a bit in this cafe. And I sort of had my head down looking at my phone or whatever. And then I started to realise that pretty much everyone in this cafe was just crying, People are sort of having this emotional breakdown around you. And it's moments like that when you realise, that it's really happening,
So we were there really for the aftermath of the occupation. Apartment blocks had been reduced to complete rubble, the entire size of buildings torn, buildings are blackened from the fire. I mean, it's actually something I don't think I've ever seen to this extent before. We had missed the real kind of shooting and the missiles and that kind of like machinery and aggressive aspect of the war, and what we had turned up to was to see the effects that the war had had on regular civilians.
We were south of Zaporizhzhia on the southern front. We'd been invited to visit the front, and we were very excited, and it was going rather well. And we met this, very kind battalion commander who gave us a breakdown of, like, right, here's the situation. And then I said, well, how close are the Russians? He goes, you can see them. Look, I can take you down to the observation post. Great, brilliant reporting. Then the word came in, someone was like, yeah, we've seen some Russian tanks. There's some tanks, there's a Russian column moving. Then suddenly the atmosphere starts getting a bit tense. The commander disappears, and someone kind of ushers you into the shelter of a building, and then this invitation to go and do some reporting in the trenches kind of vaporized. There was a school for deaf children there. We were basically kind of carjacked by refugees in a way, and asked to evacuate the last kids from the school, which we did.
Andriivka was a village in the Kyiv region that we went to time and again because it had been so badly destroyed from this occupation, and it's where we met this little girl who is now called Andriivka, calling her Andy for short, and she was just wandering among the rubble, and we just ended up falling in love with her basically. Her story isn't unique because of people had to flee the country so rapidly or were killed. There are just so many pets that are roaming the streets, so it's not a case of seeing a typical stray dog. These are domesticated animals that are so used to being loved and fed and cared for. If you just walk down the street, you'll get about 5 dogs running after you, just completely vying for your attention. It's so sad, and that's exactly what happened with Andy. She's very happy to be here in the UK now, so it's a nice thing to have come out of something that was quite devastating.
In the job, there's always this, as I was saying, there's this tension between go where the news is and your personal safety, and that line about how far you're pushing it and whether the people with you want to push it that far. It's got a little bit of incoming fire. So it's always a very, very high tension thing.
I was preoccupied by how can I stay physically safe. I don't think I'd anticipated how much of war reporting is about the human aspect and the devastation that's been caused to people's lives. If it's not someone who had a pit dug in their back garden because they were going to be buried in it, it's a woman that was raped by a Russian soldier.
I remember queuing up to get into this corner shop to get some food with Tanya, our colleague, and the air raid sirens started going off.
And I can hear an air raid siren, so I'm going to go inside.
Now, the air raid sirens are just a completely normal part of the fabric of life in Ukraine because they're going off all the time. But on the first couple of days of the war, people were understandably terrified of them, and they would be running for cover and they'd be trying to get underground. So I remember queuing up in this corner shop, and the siren goes off, which means get out of there and go to cover, and you could just see what was going on for the Ukrainians in this shop. They were thinking, do I go for cover and lose the opportunity to get some food, or do I stand outside feeling super anxious because air raid sirens are going off? And again, it's just another dilemma that were people facing from day to day, which was just terrible.
I went to a funeral of a poor 23-year-old woman who'd been raped and tortured and shot at point blank by Russians in Bucha. I was invited to her funeral by her mother and stepfather, and they brought us in for coffee at their flat ahead of the funeral. The mum was really hugging me when I said goodbye to her, and she was like stroking my hair and like wouldn't kind of stop, and it just made me feel like I've just never felt that amount of sadness for someone before. It was like ached.
The thing that I'm always going to remember for the rest of my life is not sort of stuff blowing up or bangs and artillery interceptions and all that sort of thing. It's the emotional impact that it was having on people that you were seeing sort of unfold in real time. You're watching people go through the worst trauma of their entire lives.
This is an anecdote you'll have heard all over the place because, you know, almost every Ukrainian has a story like this. Of course, he has a cousin who lives in Moscow, who used to come and visit all the time, who, you know, that they grew up together, they're mates, you know, he used to be down every summer. It is almost a cliche of this war now, but this is literally how he described it to me. He couldn't grasp how his cousin, who he'd grown up with, who was basically like a brother, would not believe him, would believe what was coming out of a Russian television set over what his own cousin in his own home village, who he knows, was telling him he was seeing with his own eyes.
I feel frustrated. I'm sad that other nations aren't doing as much as the UK to help Ukraine. I'm frustrated at how Germany and France have approached this. Seeing nearly 100 bodies dumped in a grave, and then Emmanuel Macron is still refusing to call it genocide. I'm seeing it with my own eyes. It's clearly genocide. I worry already now, a few months on, there's a bit of a fatigue and people aren't really bringing it up. I think we just need to keep this conversation going. Maybe it's naive to say that more needs to be done to stand up to Putin, but you tell me to sit opposite a woman who won't stop stroking you in a crematorium because she's just buried her only daughter, and say that you don't want to do more to stand up to this awful person. Some of the atrocities I've seen, I cannot believe have happened in the 21st century.
I lived and worked in Russia for a decade and down here in Ukraine, and I have deep personal connections to this part of the world.
I mean, the hatred is going to last generations, and it's so destructive. There's now just darkness.